listeners. Welcome back to my podcast. Today, we'll be talking about the book The Devil's Trick, written by John Boyko and published by Penguin Random House on April 13th, 2021, with the publishing date tying directly into the world at our time and the world at their time. This is because at both times, ours and the time during Vietnam, they were heavily riddled with civil rights protests. The opinion of the government being very similar to what it is during the publishing date, with government and civilian relationships not being as strong. The book itself follows Canada's involvement in the Vietnam War and how neutral we truly were. Furthermore, stay tuned to see my interview with Mick Wallace, who will talk about his and Australia's experiences. For today's podcast, we'll be talking first about the summary of the book and what's the book about. Then, we'll talk about whose perspectives are being told throughout the book, before then diving into whose perspectives aren't being told. Finally, we'll talk about the main themes of the book and how it ties into the main question of this podcast, which is, how does this show what it was like at the time in the world? Finally, to wrap up the podcast, we'll talk about why I think people should know more about the Vietnam War. The Devil's Trick follows 6 Canadians during the period of the Vietnam War, with it first following Brigadier General Sherwin Lett, who was one of the first Canadians in Vietnam, arriving over a decade before the U.S. soldiers would. The book follows Lett as him and his fellow ICC members risked their lives tending to the needs of both the South and the North Vietnamese, trying to keep the unsavable peace in the region. Next, the book follows Blair Seaborn, a Canadian diplomat sent to conduct several secret meetings between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. The book shows his views on how to stop the war and what the war would be like for the U.S., with him telling them over and over again after every meeting that the North were ready to fight and weren't scared. Furthermore, he also would tell the U.S. that he highly doubted that they would be able to win, while also telling them that all the North wanted was to be able to have an election and to be left alone. However, most of his warnings were never listened to, and the U.S. experienced in the war exactly what he warned. Continuing on, the book then follows Claire Callahan, a nurse, well, not a nurse, but an assistant to the nurse, and an anti-war protester who experienced the horrors of the war in Vietnam during her time in a field hospital there. After that, she then came home and spent the rest of the war protesting all over Canada, including when she starved herself outside the Parliament building and when she and some of her followers spent 2 weeks tenting in the middle of the winter near the building. This then drew the attention of MPs and the Prime Minister, but not many of her messages were really listened to. Next, the book follows Joe Erickson, who was one of over 30,000 draft dodgers who came to Canada, with the book talking about his experiences in Canada while also speaking about the communities of Dodgers inside of Canada. Furthermore, it also begins to speak about the general public's opinion on Dodgers and how it wasn't so high. Adding to that, the book then talks about Doug Carey, a man who traveled to the U.S. to fight in the war due to Canada making it illegal to fight in the war because they were neutral. Throughout his chapter, the book talks about his struggles during the war and after the war with PTSD, due to Canadians not being covered by the benefits of being in the Legion, as they weren't allowed to be in the Legion for years after the war due to them serving in a war they shouldn't have. Therefore, many of these men would experience tons of PTSD, with many men not finding a way out and turning to things like drugs and alcohol due to lack of support. The book follows refugee Rebecca Trim and her family during their escape from Vietnam, who, alongside thousands of other refugees going to Canada, escaped the dangers of Vietnam being brought in by the government. However, it also talks about some of the things that aren't normally talked about when we talk about refugees. It talks about something that's become a theme of this war, which is the Canadian public's dismay when they first arrived, with most Canadians feeling at the time that no Vietnamese refugees should come. Now that I've talked about the perspectives of people being told, I'll now talk about the voices missing from this book and from the history of the Vietnam War. The perspective I'd like to hear the most about is the perspective of the North Vietnamese citizens and soldiers. Throughout history, we've had a tendency to sort of mute this perspective of the enemy due to factors like propaganda, mistrust. The same can be said in this book and the Vietnam War in general. We hear a lot about the South Vietnamese and their beliefs. However, we barely hear about what the war was like for the North Vietnamese, with the majority of people not understanding the impact the war had on them. Adding to that, I wish the book also included perspectives of a villager whose village had been raided by the Americans. This is because it would give a sharp reminder that even the quote-unquote good guys do bad things, and hearing their accounts of the horror they experience would give a rather humbling or sobering experience. Finally, a perspective that is often forgotten during this time is the Australians' participation in the Vietnam War. With many people outside of Australia not knowing much about the Australian participation and only knowing really about the American participation. So this is where our guest comes in. Here to talk about his experience over the war is our guest Mick Wallace, who during the Vietnam War served in the National Army. Our special guest for today is someone very well known to me, my grandfather. He is here to speak about his and his country's experience during the Vietnam War, and while also covering the effect the U.S. had on Australia. So, hello. How are you?
Hello. Good, thanks.
So to begin with, would you like to talk about like who you are, an aspect to me, and like just who you are in general?
Yes. My name's Mick Wallace. I'm Cameron's grandfather. I live in Australia, and I've known him since 6 weeks after his birth. So.
All right. So for this podcast, we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War, and you served. Well, you didn't really serve in Vietnam, but you were a part of the Australian Army during the time. So like,
yes.
What was it like your life over this period of the war?
Well, the war started in 1962 with Australia sending a training team to train South Vietnam troops. But my involvement, I knew that it was going on, but my involvement became evident when I had to register for national service, which was a ballot you had to put your name into, and then you got picked out. They picked out birth dates. So everybody with that birth date was called up.
So it's like drafted.
Drafted.
Yeah, drafted.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what they call it here.
And
so yeah,
that's what you call it here. And we were called up, and I joined in July 1967 for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I spent all of my time in Victoria in training, and I was in the Ordnance Corps, which is the corps that used to provide all the hardware, the software, the food, etc. for the troops. We didn't have any trouble in the army with people, but when we used to go on leave with crates so that they could be put on board the ship.
All right.
So that I spent 12 months doing that. We didn't have any trouble in the army with people, but when we used to go on leave, we used to get into a bit of, people used to harass us a bit. And by the end of the war, by the time my 2 years was coming, we weren't allowed to travel in our uniforms. So,
yeah,
because that's what people were doing to us.
So I'm going to guess
we weren't bothered by it, but everybody was getting a bit upset about it in Australia, about the war. Because over that time, over the first 2 years I was in, there was 60,000 troops served in Vietnam, and 19,000 of those were conscripts or draftees.
Yeah.
Yep. And there was a lot of upset about it in the country because there's 3,000 troops were wounded and 521 killed in the total war, and half of those were were draftees or conscripts, as you call them.
Yeah.
So, it was a bit worrying at the time. There was lots of protests. We had big marches in the streets, which were called moratoriums.
Yeah, so very similar to Canada and the US. Like, there was a lot of people were like against the war and like a lot of peace rallies and stuff. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the fact that it got to the point where you couldn't walk around in your uniform was a issue. Like considering you still fought, right? It wasn't your choice to go to the war. Like to be.
Yeah, that's it.
It wasn't your war. The war wasn't your choice. So yeah.
People were sort of in favour of it, right?
Yeah.
But then as it progressed and people
As
could
people
see
died,
what was going on, and we were getting pressured by the US to keep sending more troops, people got, they had anti-feelings towards the US. So
Canada in Canada, and like over the war, we received a lot of pressure from the U.S. So my question is like, what was the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Australia during wartime?
It was pretty good. I think we had one. We had what was his name? LBJ come to Australia. Lyndon Baines, the president of the USA. He came to Australia, but he had lots of protests. There were people protesting all over the place.
Yeah.
The original Prime Minister that set all this up, Mr. Menzies, he retired, and then they left another person in charge, Harold Holt, who he went missing. He got drowned. He went missing. He went for a swim and he went missing. And there was lots of rumours around that the Chinese come and got him, the communists come and got him and all that sort of thing. But people were really lots of people were really upset about it, especially mothers of people that were getting sent, and it was called SOS, Save Our Sons. So those ladies were one of the big influences over the war, us stopping, pulling out of the war in 1970.
What effects? Because you spoke earlier about there was effects from the United States in the wartime, like they affected Australia in general. Like, what are some of those effects?
Well, one of the effects was, I think that what happened is the relationship between Australia and the US deteriorated as the war went on, and even though I don't know how much supplies we were sending to Vietnam, but the shipping, the waterside people, the workers, and we call them waterside workers. I don't know what you call them over there. Stevedores, I think. They just refused to send things across, which didn't help the position at all. But it was just really, I think it was more just a general feeling in the community that everybody was against it.
Yeah, similarly to here.
Yeah, even when people got out of the army like I did, your attitude changed a bit because you had to be careful what you said in the army, of course. But once you got out, well, people then changed their minds a bit because it was really
first effects that you noticed of the Vietnam War, and then what are the effects that are still around in your world today?
The first effects I noticed was the attitude of people towards the armed services. That was quite obvious, very obvious. We used to have, people used to harass you in the streets, and that was one of the biggest effects, which made made the national servicemen angry about it.
Drop morale, drop morale.
It made Second World War veterans angry about what was happening to the Australian soldiers. That was the major effect it had on me. And when we got out, I was not everybody, but you feel a bit unstable about the whole thing. I had friends that went to Vietnam, and some of them come back not in very good shape. So is it?
That's it.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
Sweet.
Thanks, Cameron.
No problem.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah.
All right.
That'll be good.
All right.
Have a good time in Arizona.
From this interview and from this book, we can see a lot what the world was like. It shows the political hierarchy in the world at the time, with the U.S. being considered kings, which entirely ties into why they fought in the Vietnam in the first place. This is seen in the book when Boyce talks about Vietnam in the pre-World War II era, where he talks more about France and Britain because at the time they were considered world leaders. However, when Boyce talks about the world after World War II, he talks more about the U.S. and the Soviet Union because they were the more dominant powers in the world. In addition, the book also shows us the significance of the U.S.'s decisions in the war, with the involvement costing the lives of hundreds of thousands, while also damaging the relationships between government and their population. However, I find it hard to believe this experience has changed the U.S., as they still go to fight in countries in order to stop the rise of political beliefs they disagree with, while still refusing to take lessons from the failures in the past. The best example of this is the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan was surprisingly similar to the war in Vietnam. To start off with, both wars, the U.S. refused to look back in the past to see where the other nations had failed to beat the native peoples. For example, before Vietnam, they could have seen French's failures in fighting them, and before Afghanistan, they could have seen Russia's failure. This directly connects to the main topic of the book, which is the U.S.'s influence on the world. This is because throughout the book, Canada experiences the pressure by the U.S. government and specifically the president to join the war, with countries' relationship being strained due to them not joining. Furthermore, throughout the book and the time period, Canada and the world were affected by the U.S. and the USSR's conflict, as many people were fearing nuclear holocaust. A good example of this fear and this influence was the Korean War, with Canadians being sent in to fight. Furthermore, another huge impact and really noticeable change in Canada due to the Cold War was a huge increase in the defense budget and eventually the return of troops to Europe. Furthermore, another example of this was the Canadian military-run fallout shelters, which were designed to continue the government in case of a nuclear holocaust. Furthermore, air sirens were installed all over the country, with NATO troops being sent in, with many of them being Canadians, to Germany. In addition, not just the U.S. government influenced the world, but also the U.S. people, with most peace protests against the war being highly based off the U.S. peace protests. A best example of this is the Australians, who decided to protest after seeing the U.S. ones and after their own disagreements with the war. Should you know about the Vietnam War and Canada's impact on it? I think that people should know about Canada's involvement, and that it should be a topic talked more about in school and in the country. This is because Vietnam is an important part of world history, and it's important that Canadians know about our involvement in it. Furthermore, I think people should read the story I read, because it gives a valuable perspective on politics and the political hierarchy at the time, with Americans considering themselves as gods. Furthermore, hundreds of Canadians died while thousands served. And I think it's important for people to know the injustices that were done to the Vietnamese in the country and to Canadians when they returned from fighting. That'll be all for today's podcast. I highly insist you consider reading the book The Devil's Trick. If you want to learn more about this topic, please refer to my worked cited list. Finally, if you want to hear more from my interview, or if you want to hear the full interview, click the link below. Thank you for listening.